Hi, everybody. This is Alan Hollander. Welcome to our newest episode of Inside the Practice. Very excited today to have a very special guest with us. She is, and of course, my wonderful cohort here, Sarah Boylan. Hello, Sarah.
Nice to see you, Alan.
Thank you. You know, we try to bring you the most current help and information related to practice efficiency, practice growth, and anything else related to the industry, the dental industry that we are very much immersed in. And today we have a family member. I say that figuratively, but she might as well be a family member. She is a family member. That is Wendy Reifer. Wendy and I have worked together for over 20 years. Wendy worked in my former consulting company, which was arguably one of the largest practice consulting firms in the country. When I started ePractice Manager, I guess 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, Wendy happened to be available for my good fortune as a free agent. She came aboard with me. She's been instrumental in building our company over the years. She is truly the consultant's consultant. And, we're very much involved in specialty practices, OMS, perio, and the like. Of course, we are rooted in the general practice area as well, having worked with many hundreds of them, thousands of them. So, but Wendy is a true expert in practice management. And when somebody throws a question at me that I just don't have the current information for, I text Wendy. She will randomly get texts and calls from me and say, please get back to me right away. And she always does. She's wonderful. So Wendy, it's so good to have you here.
Thank you for having me. What a treat this is. Nice to see you guys in this format and be able to chat a little bit today.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the problem with having somebody like Wendy is we could talk about any area of the practice. We could. I'm sorry, Wendy. I don't want to make it too tough for you, but we could.
Well, that's flattering. Sarah and I were talking about the things that are most impacting for practices, and it is difficult to narrow down. They've got a lot to juggle and a lot to be successful with and all of that. So I think we're in Sarah's good hands.
Yes, we are. We are. Sarah, should we dive in?
Yeah, let's just piggyback right off that last comment. What are the most common challenges you see in dental practices you face today?
Yeah.
Right. Well, we've all seen in every industry, every sector of business, what's happening with the employment market, right? Mm-hmm. So I have to say that is really at the top of the list for our clients. And it's more the HR side of things in total than it is just hiring, so to speak. So right now we're working quite a bit with our clients on moving over from just an acute, immediate hiring need that they might have for a position, trying to just grab a warm body and throw them into a position and keep the wheels turning type of thing, and really educate them on what a passive hiring phase and what overall recruitment looks like for a practice. And these practices have to always be recruiting, and they are now, and they're seeing great results from just kind of always having an ear to the ground for the right person, lots and lots of outreach going on at all times, grabbing talent where they find it, properly assessing the allocation of staff in the various departments throughout the practice, And then, the partner concept to all of that is, what about the existing staff? So we're working with practices an awful lot on staff development so that
Nice.
existing employees really get that, not just support that they need, but the ongoing skills-based, process-based improvement that will accumulate and start to pay off for the practices in terms of that efficiency and growth.
Nice.
Yeah, interesting. What were you going to say, Sarah?
Well, I was just going to ask, do you see sounds like you got a lot of cross training going on too, then maybe?
Well, it's interesting. So cross training, I'm of two minds about that concept, right? It was a big buzzword at one point, and it certainly has a coverage necessity in a practice. People need to know how to do more than one thing, especially in a smaller practice environment. People take vacations, they go out on leave, or whatever the case may be. So it's handy, but on an everyday basis, we really try and staff so that people can be experts in their situation, in their department, in their position, and they can have the continuity of their own work and get highly trained at that, right? So, of course, if coverage is needed, we'll all cover, right? I'll answer the phone. Doesn't matter, all good. But being able to be an expert in your department is a pretty big deal. It also allows, which is another point that contributes to this, for expectation management, true expectation management in a practice, right? Where we can say, this is what's needed from your position, and I will help you to be able to get that result and produce that result in volume and whatever the case may be. But it's not a vague concept like it is when you have multiple people, rotating through the same position at any given time.
Right.
Yeah, very interesting. Just to back up a little bit, Wendy, I've always liked the idea of a busy practice, particularly since COVID and since these issues that we are observing all the time now. No matter where you go, people tell you there's shortages of people out there. Everybody's area and market is the most competitive for employees and the toughest, no matter where you are, from Montgomery, Alabama to Los Angeles. But I like this concept of hiring, or just always looking and having your ear to the ground for potential personnel. Can you talk a little bit more about that and about the particulars of that? Because I think that people's response often is, okay, great. So you find somebody new, they're good, they're hot, you'd like to bring them aboard. You really don't need them then, but you're thinking, wow, if something happens, I could really use this person. I mean, that's a realistic and I think a practical concern about doing this. How do you deal with that?
Well, there's a pretty great need in a practice to capture all of the opportunities for efficiency and patient care, right? I don't think there's any practice I've ever worked with that says, oh no, we have all of the bases covered and then some, right? We call every patient when we should. We support every doctor and team member when we should. We market adequately. Our accounts are all completely under control. We've never had a late account ever. That's really not the scenario that we walk into, right? So let's say that you're in this recruitment mentality, right? And you happen to stumble upon a great opportunity and you want to bring this person to your team. In general, as a regular onboarding process, we like to have people do some stations training and go through the different parts of the practice, and at a minimum observe operations in those sectors, but sometimes actually have an experience of contributing to what that department needs at any given time. And once that starts taking place, you can see that there are particular backlogs in a given area or process improvement that we've been trying to get to, but we haven't quite changed out our vendor and updated our system and trained the whole staff. And you have one person who's doing it the way we want it done, but that's not really been incorporated throughout the whole team. So this is a great opportunity to use the bandwidth of an additional talented hire and bring them into the practice and kind of have them use this stations approach to basically level up, right? And get the practice on its feet in all these different areas. You then have this team member who can be deployed to a more full-time sector of the practice, and they've got a well-rounded experience in terms of how this practice really runs and what our objectives are.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great, I think that's a great point. And it's funny now that you mention it, I don't think I've been in a practice. There've been an awful lot of them over the past, 24 months. I don't think I've been in a practice once that didn't have a personnel need of some kind.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I have not seen a practice that has taken this approach that hasn't been glad of it later on, right? Where they've been able to say, now wait a minute, I've got this generally experienced and skilled person. They've gone from department to department and kind of shored up that activity, or at a minimum gotten this experience. And now they're not better for it in their, permanent assignment in the practice. Nobody's ever come to me with that complaint before.
I hear you. Totally hear you.
So do you ever experience pushback though? I mean, as far as it's the cost of, we know what it's like to onboard another employee and the cost that's associated with that. How do you get past the objection part of that?
Yeah, well, this scenario is kind of at the end of the road, right? Earlier than that, we work with practices an awful lot to do a proper allocation of staff and really say, how much work needs to be done in this practice and what resources do we have to accomplish all of that? And sometimes we find that practices will say, well, we don't need 2 people at the front, or we don't need 3 people in the treatment coordination area or something like that. Well, when you analyze the numbers, and we have great tracking systems for this, so now it's not a vague concept anymore, right? We analyze those numbers and we look at the missed opportunities that are taking place from not following up with patients who have unscheduled treatment, for example, or patients who have been referred to the practice but haven't gotten into our consult line quite yet in one form or another. You start taking a look at the impact of fully staffing that activity. You can run a pilot on that type of thing and see the immediate change and impact that takes place. And next thing you know, you're not looking uphill at spending money. You're really considering how much you're costing practice income if you don't do these things. And so we're not interested in running up the numbers on the staffing at all. But if we've got the value associated with this and it maths out correctly for these practices, they're faster than I am at implementation on this thing. I can't talk them out of it at that point.
Well, I can even speak from my own experience. I had one situation where we just added one more dental assistant and it just blew my mind how quickly we were just increasing production. Just week after week, we just got more and more efficient with it. So I definitely see how this is so beneficial for practices to do this.
Well, and the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? So people will have big resistance to something like this, and then they have an experience with either, as you said, the rooms, the assistants, the phone capacity, managing their accounts on the back end, something like that. And next thing you know, I've got people coming to me saying, Wendy, I need 8 assistants. I really do. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, let's do the math on that. And it's true, though, if it contributes to the productivity and increases the capacity, even if it just improves the efficiency, that's something these practices are considering every day now.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Yeah, it's interesting to me in observing many of the practices that come aboard with us. What I see is people get brought on, and generally speaking, how they're onboarded and trained and integrated into the practice in a methodical manner that is laid out and predictable and so forth. Like what you're saying, this station training.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, when people get very, very busy, what is the first thing that drops out? Training.
Oh yeah.
There's no time to train people. How many thousands of times have we heard that? But the cost to the practice of not training somebody and having them take a year to get up to speed as opposed to 3 months is massive.
Not to mention the fact that after a year, they're very likely using their own ideas about how to do something. It's not necessarily that they're incorporating the practice processes appropriately, right?
Yeah.
So if we go to a practice and we say, hey, we need to train someone, I do get a lot of pushback on that. Wendy, I do not have a full-time trainer in this practice. We're hiring for a reason. That's because there's a hole here and we need to fill that hole. And I understand, I really do. But we work a lot with onboarding and training checklists at ePractice Manager, and it kills 2 birds with 1 stone, right? So maybe multiple birds. First of all, we train off of resources and material that's the same for everybody. So it's not the last person's knowledge being passed on to the next person's knowledge. And we've got that.
Or their mistakes.
Correct. And so that's one aspect. But the other thing is that it's so well defined that you can just say, okay, this person is with Sarah today. Sarah doesn't have to quit her day job, become a full-time trainer, not do her work today or anything like that. She's just got a thin responsibility to pass on some expertise and kind of oversee the skills management of this person for this task or this day, right? And then you can spread that out throughout the practice. And before you know it, your need has been met, right? It doesn't have to be a full-time all quit equation for people to get this result if it's well organized, but it does take that.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Really just, we've seen it over and over again. And certainly you would know. Hey, I want to ask you a question. We focus, I know you focus, people come aboard generally because there are issues or situations in the practice that they don't feel that they have the capacity to solve by themselves. So they look for outside support, of course, from us. And we're digging around and always looking for situations that what are the things that need to be bolstered and repaired to improve the practice or get the kind of growth that we would anticipate from a practice working with us. I'm interested, Wendy, in, when these practices are up and running smoothly. I mean, we have some of the highest producing surgeons and specialists in the country.
That's right.
I mean, we're talking just really probably the top 5%.
Agreed.
And what is it? I'd like you to share your take on this in those practices that start to really hum along and show regular growth. And it's not that they don't have problems, because when you're growing, you always have problems. They're just of a different nature. But you have solutions as well. And you have systems that will help solve problems. What are the characteristics of a practice that is kind of at that optimal level?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because sometimes practices experience over expansion and they get to that level and they find that they're not systematized well enough to keep up with the current level of demand.
Yeah.
And usually by the time they come onto our program, we start working with them and they say, we don't have any systems. And I would like to beg to differ on that, because they do have systems. They wouldn't be where they are if they didn't. And some of those systems are actually pretty great. But it takes pulling that apart and putting it back together, given the current set of circumstances, and really evaluating the workability. So of course, they always have an inspection process that's going on, and it's pretty objective and transparent. There's no hidden agenda. And these teams get up to the point where the team members, the middle management, the upper management, the ownership, all has a great mechanism for being able to look at something in this moment, see how well it is performing, and then objectively come up with what needs to happen to reinforce the positive things and what needs to happen to troubleshoot or, get into supportive action with those things that are not quite up to par. So that attitude, I would say, is a big transformation for practices. It's very normalized and ho-hum to be able to say, oh, we have either a stat or a particular indicator that's, moving in a particular direction. Let's see what's contributing to it. Let's see what's needs to be reinforced. Let's see what needs to be, oh boy, we got to take this one down to the studs and build it back up. I found over time, these people already work quite hard at their trade, right? If you give them something to work hard at, let's say it's not good news, right? They've got a system that just needs to be absolutely overhauled or is not producing at an optimal level. That stings for a moment, but they would rather be able to roll their sleeves up and apply the right technique to that situation and get to where they want to be than to sit there and spin their wheels. And that's the typical frustration that we see, is it just hasn't been inspected thoroughly enough. It hasn't been analyzed and strategized enough that they can fill in the gaps for where the right thing needs to take place. It's a real healthy approach to a practice, and everybody responds very well to that.
Yeah. Is there a common system that you see that needs to be rehashed over, like redone frequently in offices?
Yeah, we take a top-down approach, meaning that we start with the doctor themselves and take a look at everything from their performance, right, as a provider, to their leadership and contribution to the management. And then we move on down through upper management, middle management, and the rest of the departments. And we find that by the time we get further and further through the equation, most things will take care of themselves, if that makes sense. Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that makes the highlight reel when you go at it that way is the communication processes in the practice. First of all, Alan will tell you, every practice that comes aboard with us, you ask the staff what's wrong with the practice, and they say communication. It's a bit of a junk drawer category. People will take all of their problems and put it in that communication compartment, if you will. But when you start pulling that apart, really, it's having the right communication on the right topics and having the help actually help people. You see what I'm saying? If you give somebody a tool that they can actually use and it creates a change, it makes things easier for people given their circumstances. That's really where the tide starts to turn.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, okay, so can we talk a little bit about the tools for the toolbox by chance? Like, do you have a specific example of like what type of communication tool would be super useful in a practice?
I want to reinforce her question, because I was going to ask a similar one, but more specifically, the survey, that data on communication, Wendy, that you're mentioning, comes from directly off of questionnaires, of which we have done thousands over the years. This is feedback from employees and practices. And in just about every practice, I can't count how many at this point, the subject of communication comes up. Now, what that means when you drill down and you get that person, let us say, who had that survey and said communication, what that means is, well, somebody in the front isn't getting the communication they want from somebody in the back, or vice versa. We know that is historically an issue where communication and coordination is lacking. Or it can be somebody who isn't getting the communication with the office manager or the doctor, heaven forbid, that they need to have or would like to have. It could be in the form of job performance reviews, where people need feedback and communication. So I see the meetings that people have. It comes up all the time where staff don't like meetings. They don't like them. But meetings can be great. And Sarah, to your point on the tools, perhaps, Wendy, you could comment on communication in meetings and how that tool, if you will, is vitally important to having an effective interaction with staff.
Yeah. Well, both of you have made great points. So first of all, there are dozens of tools to use in response to what has been diagnosed as a communication problem in a practice. Sometimes it's about people, sometimes it's about a system. Could be any number of things. But let's take Alan's example of meetings. People who are craving communication, pretty textbook answer would be, well, then we need to have the correct meeting so everybody trades information back and forth and we're all briefed. The eye rolling that occurs at the time of that suggestion on the part of everybody involved is absolutely epic, right? I mean, and what you find you're running into is they don't want more of the same, right? They often do have unoptimized meetings that are non-productive, that go down the rabbit hole and don't particularly ever accomplish what they set out to do. So it's quite disheartening for our clients to hear that some version of meetings or meeting modification is on deck for them. However, once they start seeing what healthy looks like with meetings, right? That they're short, they're concise, they're agendized, they have a purpose and an outcome. It's not all on one person to wear that responsibility and climb up that mountain by themselves kind of thing. I got to say again, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? We end up with people who are so glad for the revisions, and we have a basic battery of 5 or 6 meetings for a practice. We start by getting the doctor out of meetings that he or she does not need to be in, because that is a point of friction in the first place. And it goes both ways, right? The team doesn't need the doctor there for that, and the doctor doesn't want to or need to be there for that. But the doctor's own management work is then supported by these meetings that have occurred throughout the different parts of the practice. And that data flows upwards to the doctor, who can then be involved in the proper decision-making, budget management, creativity having to do with a particular solution for the practice, that kind of thing. So it really takes the work and puts it where it belongs in the practice. And that sounds like a small thing, but it's one of the biggest things, is to identify where something belongs, stably put it there in the practice, get the right people tending to it. And then if you give them a tool like a proper meeting agenda and guide them through it a few times, boy, is it fast and efficient and productive, and the value is right there to be seen.
Nice. Good.
That's excellent.
Excellent. Sarah, did you have a question or something else you'd like to pick Wendy's brain on here?
Of course. We've got all kinds of things that we could chat about with Miss Wendy. You mentioned, talk about having the doctors in meetings and out of meetings, which of course, I kind of wanted to touch on leadership in this chat that we have. And what are those? Are there some specific key elements that these doctors should be focused on for leading their team? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that leadership in a practice, well, obviously is ultimately a doctor's responsibility. I think one of the best things to see happen with our clients is that teamwork between a doctor and the management arm of the practice, and the ability to share that leadership responsibility. So when we are interacting with clients at the beginning of a program, we ask doctors, self-assessment on leadership or their own approach to leadership. And these are some of the most successful, intelligent, highly productive individuals in the field. And they act like they don't have any experience with leadership. Of course they do. Of course they do. But you can tell that it's a pressure point in the practice, something that they struggle with. And about half of it is they're not doing as much as they think they should be doing. And about the other half of it is that they don't necessarily know how to do better at what they're already doing. So we try and take a very simple concept at that point and build it into the actual leadership training, which is you don't have to be great at managing something if you try and tackle it when it's not happening, right? So let's say we already have an acute problem. Staff member is blowing up, a patient situation has gone by the wayside, there's a money situation, there's a schedule situation. It's really a difficult thing, right? Because we don't have any time to handle the problem. We must handle it urgently. Those communication processes are all compounded right into one moment kind of thing. So one of the reasons why we use these management tools is because we switch over from being reactive to whatever situation presents itself in daily operations in a practice to as much proactivity as we can have. No practice ever gets 100% proactive. And even if they do, there's still a new challenge in the environment that will come down the pike. But when we give practices an opportunity to regard the right things at the right interval, right? Does this particular subject need daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual oversight? What is required here to actually remain proactive on this subject? You find that observation and those techniques come easier and easier for people because they're not having to play defense right in that moment or spin off one answer for that one patient that then becomes policy forever. Whereas, if we're doing this in the right format, we take a few steps back and we say, okay, this handles this one situation, but globally, this is how we want to address this situation for the practice. And that small shift of doing two things at one time instead of just answering one question at a time and having it become policy or the way that we operate from there forward, that's a very big part of leadership, right? And it's specific. So our doctors respond very well to it when we say, okay, here's the oversight that's needed, here's the interval that's needed, and here's the desired outcome, which is maybe take a right now example, but give a global approach and answer to that. That's a pretty special sector of development for our doctors and our leadership teams.
Yeah, that's very good, Wendy. Very good stuff. Hey, speaking of leadership, you do get into practices often now, and this is really, I think, a symptom of a lot of turnover in practices. It's rare that you go into a practice. I mean, you'll find a couple of hardcore people, perhaps, who've been there for years, but the number of practices that we go into where the staff is new, most of the staff is new. We're talking less than a year, 6 months, 8 months. And that can, if they're not brought on really well, that can result in a lot of problems. But I'd like to hear your response to advice that you have for handling, the dynamics or, of conflict in the office, which, happens in varying degrees, from just a little bit of backbiting to some real serious conflict and cliques and so forth. And how do you address that when you see something like that?
Yeah, we aim at the beginning of our program to set about on an approach to this that's intentional, right, with our doctors and our managers and our practices. So we work very hard, even at the beginning of the program, again, when something is not happening, right, as an urgent issue in the practice, to learn how to change the subject in challenging conversations. And to always realize that if we're using people's names or perhaps the wrong pronouns of the I want this and you said that, and the potentially inflammatory parts of communication that can take place, that we always shift this over to a communication about a patient, right? If we do that, we're kind of in the wholesome territory of addressing either the patient scenario, the system that serves that patient, the part of the practice that's responsible for that outcome. And it tends to snap those conversations on topic and turn them more productive more quickly, right? So quickly eliminated from the situation is who thought what about what, how many times it happened, how bad it was, the severity of the situation, right? And we can say, okay, we have an elderly patient here today. She had to drive from another town. She's not set up for her situation whatsoever. That came about from a number of different circumstances, and we'll get to that later. But in the right here and now, here's what we're going to do for this patient. And we're going to huddle up afterwards. We're going to take a look at what part of this didn't happen as it should have. It's very objective to approach things this way because the thing that went off the rails could be related to the patient, and it often is, right? Some kind of a misunderstanding, but that still gives us the opportunity to take greater responsibility and say, okay, whatever communication we had with this patient still didn't land, and we did not get the desired outcome. So with that in mind, do we have to change anything about our process, or is this just an exception, right? And now we're not talking about people and finger pointing and et cetera. So let's give a better example, right? Somebody keeps coming in late and the other person has to cover for them, and it is very contentious, right? Even that conversation can be turned pretty quickly to say, okay, let's take a look at the schedule. We could have anywhere from 3 to 15 patients to check in the 8 o'clock hour. What is the proper staff allocation for that? Okay, who is assigned to that particular functionality? Okay, is that enough in the first place? And then we're still trying to make up ground for when we have these little exceptions that take place, or are we just improperly staffed altogether? And even if the answer is, oh yes, we should be able to do what we're trying to do with what we have, then it gives the opportunity to tighten that up, and everybody has perspective, right? The person who's been wronged has perspective. The person who perhaps has these transgressions in terms of their attendance has that perspective. And now it's out there, and we have the ability, we've kind of empowered the practice to actually use their tools and march through some progressive discipline with that person if that's required, because the transparency is there. We're talking about it, we're showing it, and we're putting it in a patient context. It's not how we feel about that individual. And practices who know that they're in the right, they've done everything they can to support this process and this employee, they do feel more empowered to walk through those progressive discipline steps and have it serve the practice as it should. A person gets an opportunity to respond to that and then really change things, or they don't. And that may or may not work for the practice, but it's a whole different ballgame at that point.
Yeah, that's very good. I like that. That internal conflict, kind of, you can acknowledge it, but just sort of directing that energy, negative or otherwise, towards, okay, understood. Now we have patients to take care of. That is why we're here. And that is, I don't think people really get how powerful that is, because most people who will come to work in a healthcare environment do it because they do want to help. They know that they can really help people improve their lives and improve their health. And what I like about this is you're focusing that negativity and channeling it more towards, look, hey guys, understood. Can we talk about the patient who had to wait 10 minutes now because of this scheduling screw up? Understood it's a screw up, fine. We'll get to that. But look, let's talk about the impact on the schedule and on the patients. That's why we're here. That's the unifying, that's the common thread for everybody. It's the purpose. It's what really drives the practice. And that's what I like about your saying. You're talking about it in the context of improving patients' lives.
Right. And it leads right into the next concept quite nicely, right? Without even trying, you now get to say, okay, so what does success look like? What is ideal, right? What are we aiming for? What's a win in this context?
Yeah.
And then we identify what patient characteristics, what practice characteristics have to come together in just the right way to get this particular outcome, right? So now people are being led through leadership. They're being led through process improvement in the easiest of ways, just by taking it back to the purpose. And so when people say, how do I have difficult conversations? One of the potential answers is don't have one. You don't have to have a difficult conversation. You can reroute this conversation to the purposeful part of things. Yeah. Let it show every other part of the equation quite objectively. And then you would really have to have someone sticking out like a sore thumb on poor behavior, lack of uptake with the practice, purpose and patient care. Even that makes things quite easy. We know what we're dealing with. We know what to do about it, right?
Yeah, that's really good. It would stick out like a sore thumb. I mean, what is somebody going to say? I don't really care about the impact on the patient.
Right.
I care about the fact that Susie made me work a little bit harder, or this employee made me work a little bit harder. Yes, there's something to address. I'm not saying sweep it under the table and ignore it and apply the appropriate correction or progressive discipline to it. But again, the focus is on this is why we're here. It's good.
Absolutely. And it's wonderful to watch a practice and a doctor owner and potentially the team activate this tool, right? Because sometimes they don't feel like they can use all of their tools. They're not sure if they've got it right. They're not sure if the person has it coming, things like that, right? When it's all so obvious like this, boy, do they use every bit of the tools that are to hand. It's wonderful to see.
Yeah. Wendy, really good, really good. And I'd like to hire you if you're available. I think you'd probably make a great consultant. Wendy, our team, we're available to answer your questions. Normally, we would say to our guests, "Hey, let everybody know how they can contact you." Well, we'll have as a tag at the end of this Wendy's email. You can feel free to reach out to her. Certainly, you can reach out to Sarah or myself. We'll have let's get our email addresses up there. We'd be delighted to just answer your questions. We love to help. Hope you have found this useful and will enjoy it and pass it along to those who you think would get benefit from it. This is Inside the Practice. I'm Alan Hollander. I'm the CEO of ePractice Manager. We've had Wendy, our VP Consulting, with us today. Thank you so much, Wendy. And Sarah Boylan, our experienced colleague here with us. Also, by the way, a longtime, very, very experienced office manager. We've got a great, real expert team here. So anyway, great to have all of you with us today. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time on Inside the Practice.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Wendy.